Herr Krüger. Ich hätte sehr viele Fragen an Sie.
Mr. Krüger, I have many questions, but I would like to leave the questions to Mrs. Corinna Milborn, who is going to lead a discussion, and I would like to give the floor to her. Thank you very much for your contribution. We are going to discuss this topic right away. Sorry, I have a cold. So we are going to discuss this topic right away, and we will concentrate on some of the topics that you introduced. I would like to announce Robina Möhring, the president of the Austrian section of Reporters Without Borders. Then I would like to ask on stage Michael Rüegg, an editor-in-chief from Switzerland. Good morning. And a Slovak author who wrote a book about troll factories and fake news, Mr. Kowetzki. Maybe Rubina, you can come to my side. We have 40 to 50 minutes. I would like to discuss about the EU elections, and I would like to start with the status quo of the freedom of the press in the EU, to take a look at this topic from different prisms and also from the perspective of Switzerland. And I would also like to discuss about the attacks on public broadcasters, and I would also like to talk about the influence of social media when it comes to disseminating information in an unfiltered manner. Let's start with the freedom of the press. Mrs. Möhring, Reporters Without Borders, was cited several times. So is it really that bad if you move around in Europe? Well, we all do our job. We know about the situation of our colleagues in Turkey. I think that we are very hard hit in Austria. And this is the situation I can assess best. I would like to cite a colleague from Hungary who said she was the head of the media authority in Budapest, and she was fired by Orban, and then she went to Austria, and she's now a teacher at the university. And she said 1 year ago that it was frightening that we are witnessing a development that is similar to the development in Hungary, and no one seems to recognize this development, and if people do, then it is already too late. So thank God we have this ranking from Reporters Without Borders. I would like to take Austria as an example. And Austria, the situation of Austria deteriorated by 5 points. And the sad thing is that Austria used to rank 11th, which is in the white area, so to speak, very okay in terms of democracy. Now it ranks 16th. This is the first rank in the yellow area, where you have to take a closer look if everything is okay in terms of democracy. So this is a very sad fact. And if we take a look at our politicians, at the members of our government, I could even imagine that next year the situation will worsen next year. You already talked about the AfD in Germany with its dedicated program. The FPO already has its dedicated program on YouTube. They have done it very, very professionally. And many others have not succeeded in jumping this bandwagon. We have to be very careful in terms of where we are headed, and maybe also develop programs countering this trend. And what I think is very important is that public broadcasters have to be supported, so they should not cater to the interests of the state. They should not be financed by government sources. So let's take a look beyond our borders, but I would like to ask the audience, who of you is worried when it comes to freedom of the press in Europe? If so, please raise your hands. So who thinks that everything is okay and that our concerns are exaggerated? So few, about 50%. So let's take a look at Slovakia. So what comes to mind is the murder of an investigative journalist in Slovakia. This led to a crisis in government. So has the situation improved now, or was there no improvement? First of all, thank you for the invitation. Dobrý den, about the situation in Slovakia. So it's a country characterized by a grave division. This murder of this journalist and his fiancée, so represented as a caesura in the development and the history of the country. So this prompted the development of a new civil society initiated by young people who had taken to the streets and demonstrated against corruption and for Europe. And they wanted to the state to investigate this murder. And who was responsible for this murder? It was an unscrupulous media oligarch. He has been arrested, and there is intensive work on this case going on, and I hope that there will be legal proceedings, because this is what Slovakia urgently needs in order to again find trust in the rule of law. But on the other hand, well, we have to say that there were very surprising presidential elections in the age of populism. We in small Slovakia saw that already in 2019 it is possible that a new type of politician can rise to power, a politician who is pro-European, open to the world. No, if citizens are really committed, if they go to the polls, then it is possible to change things. So it's the first woman who rose to power in Slovakia, but on the other hand, during these presidential elections, we had 25% in the first round who voted for anti-democratic forces. So we have seen very clearly an ever more pronounced influence of disinformation, media, trolling, factories, fake news reaching large majorities. And what has also changed is that it is no longer a secret. They are no longer working undercover. And they're very proud that they are supported by forces from Russia. They are not ashamed of this fact. So, and this was called treason some time ago, and now they call themselves the true Slovak patriots. So very often there is no logic in fake news. We know that. So Slovakia is a country that hopefully also during the parliamentary elections next year will be more pro-democratic. But as many countries, Hungary, Austria, it's deeply divided between pro-democratic and anti-democratic forces. So, well, I would like to tie in with the topic of fake news and troll factories. Let's talk about freedom of the press. And I would like to take another glance at Switzerland. Switzerland ranks 6th in this Reporters Without Borders ranking, so totally in the white area. So is it an island of the blessed, or have you seen that things are changing? You said that it is quite excessive to find fault at a level of near perfection, but you talked about the example of public broadcasters. So 1 year ago we held a referendum about the question what we should do in terms with the public broadcasters, if we should keep them, if we should do away with them. And fortunately enough, people voted for retaining public broadcasters. So we weathered this crisis. And I totally agree with what you said, Mr. Krüger. I used to work as a local journalist, and sometimes you are prone to see these things as isolated incidents, as tragic, isolated incidents. So I got a story from a party way back then which had a very stupid idea. Everything went wrong, but they tried to present their failure as a success, and my very nice colleague just wrote down everything that happened, and she didn't see what was going on, and I refused it, and of course this didn't meet with the approval of the party, and it didn't talk to us for many months. And there are so many little isolated incidents we never hear about. We have been around for 1 year and 4 months, and I really have to say, well, it would be a nice thing that we spend less money on paying attorneys. So there are many things that we are checking beforehand. It's not about the question, should we publish things? So very often we have to ask ourselves, should we use this word? So we have to be very, very careful when it comes to using sensitive little words. I have a very, very bad feeling when we speak about the courts. So we have one case which will go to the Supreme Court. We are of the opinion that it is very important that journalists are not excluded, that accredited journalists are not excluded from court halls. And we will see what the Supreme Court has to say on this matter. Now, I would like to talk about fake news and the troll factories, because this topic has been huge. And then I would like to talk about public broadcasters. You wrote a novel about it. And also, it is a topic which is huge on the agenda of the EU elections. This is something that also has an influence on the freedom of the press, because especially right-wing politicians, AfD, FPO in Austria, get the possibility to directly talk to their audience. So what about the threat that things get out of hand and that editorial media are going to die? Well, I don't think that they are going to die. But we think that political forces in Europe are trying to express themselves in an independent fashion. We see that in America, with a very, very strong democratic landscape, where the president almost every day takes a very critical stance on freelance journalists, claiming that they're all liars, that it's all mendacious press. And if you purport it over the space of months and years, this of course also has an impact in terms of the credibility of the media. Credibility of the media, especially in Western democracy, has been going down dramatically. And this also has an impact on the trust that people place in media. And it's very hard for them to distinguish between truth and lies. And very often we have the problem that things get out of hand, that we have to grapple with corruption. We saw that in Slovakia, before the murder of the journalist, we talked about verbal assaults on journalists became something that was widely accepted, that became day-to-day practice. After the murder, some journalists were persecuted by a mafia-like criminal organization. They were photographed. Also, their family and friends were being persecuted. So there are attempts to blackmail journalists and to obtain information from them in a violent way in many Eastern European countries, and then to misuse this information to obtain information we have seen that many critical journalists in Eastern Europe are subject to continuous assault. We are accused of, well, people say that we are fouling our own nests. People say that we want to damage the reputation of our countries, but quite to the contrary, we want to foster progress and democracy in our own countries. So this pressure is mounting. And so it's all the better that especially this wave of solidarity has been very, very surprising. Also from Austria, Germany and Switzerland, after the murder of Mr. Kurzek, interest rose in terms of the concerns, in terms of the support that is needed so that we can network much better internationally and also foster a protection against those in power. Mr. Krüger, one question. A method to threaten the freedom of the press which does not amount to censorship, well, which is being done via anonymous accounts and where attacks on individual journalists are being launched, they're being ridiculed, attacked. It has been extremely striking in Germany when I think about colleagues in Germany with a migration background, and many have told me, well, I don't know if it is worthwhile to come to terms with all the threats. Should we take to the streets? Should we publish a declaration? So I think it's much harder to handle than pure censorship. I think the most original idea was one that journalists with a migration background came up publicly. They read out these hate speech mails, which are quite frightening. But after 30 minutes, the audience starts slapping its thighs because at the end of the day, these attacks are also funny and comical, and by playing it back into the space, we also witness some revenge. And it's not about the freedom of the press, but it's also about the diversity of opinions. And in democracies, and in which are becoming ever more heterogeneous, diversity of opinions is very important, and journalists are also important for this. So it's not a question of the position taken by journalists towards vis-à-vis governments, businesses, but it's also important for them to have a space in which they can voice their opinions, in which they can voice a diversity of opinions, and can also make a positive comment one day and take a critical stance the next day, if you think about constructive journalism. So there is a modicum of truth in this. I think we should take a close look, and journalists should take an independent role. They should reflect the plurality of opinions.
And of course, there's a lot of economic pressure and also political pressure. But we have to criticize this pressure publicly. I used to be a member of the German Bundestag, the parliament, and I know when they get angry, the members of the parliament, they're quick to make a phone call to the journalists and tell them they have to tell the story completely differently. I was raised in the GDR, and I remember what it was like. There was no alternative opinion. No other opinion tolerated than the party's official line, and this made me value and appreciate how dangerous such behavior is. Members of a political party that feel threatened by journalism. I think criticism should be part of our public, of our political public, and this is part of a politician's job to be criticized. But it seems that there's a lot of investment into skepticism towards journalists. Politicians just keep criticizing the press and trying to make them write the things that they want. And we need to have checks and balances and true journalistic independence. Just one last point. I believe that digitalization has prepared the path for political criticism. Let me just come back to that. I just want to say something. You said members of the political parties and politicians should be a little bit more relaxed and not criticize journalists all the time. But that's what citizens are allowed to do. Every citizen can criticize. Ms. Möhring, why do reporters react so strongly to the anger vented by members of the parliament if there are calls to change reporting? And that happens all the time, but why is that the case? Well, in Austria, there's a very strong concentration of media. There are basically two independent print media, Der Standard and Der Falter, which is a weekly newspaper, and all others are owned by groups, by corporations. And you can imagine what that means, because corporations are mostly interested in money and not in independent reporting. And of course, they need to have a good rapport with the government. And that is a big problem in Austria. But there's another thing. You said it doesn't have to do anything with democracy, but democracy is a work in progress. And I have the feeling that people are getting tired, sick and tired of. They defend not just journalists, but the entire public. They defend the wealth that they have created, and they don't want to share anymore, which is different than it used to be. And a second development that is dangerous, in my opinion, is that the time of the so-called Third Reich is something that most people don't know what it was like anymore, because the witnesses have passed away. No one remembers what it is like to have no independent press anymore. And so people don't even know this anymore. As you said, for example, in Hungary, most people didn't pay attention in history class, and that's maybe also true for the United States, because the lying press and things like that, that was brought to the public again by President Trump for the first time, but that is something that used to be a factor before, and it leads to a loss of credibility of journalists, but also to a disruption within society. And journalists are a good measure of what's happening in a society. As soon as people start to lie and distribute lies about other people, that's a really dangerous development, because that we've had that before. So I think political education is really important, and everything that has to do with media has to be taught as early as in elementary school, how to deal with internet media. It's important that children learn to sort of categorize different forms of reporting and know when it's propaganda and when it is independent. Many media belong to corporations, but still it's the responsibility of the editor-in-chief to keep up the independence of reporting. You come from local journalism, and maybe you can tell me, why is there a lack of possibility or also confidence in reporting? Just one remark on the editors-in-chief. Sometimes they have their own bonus in mind when they do their work. I once counted all the departments and their press spokespeople, so their press representatives, and I compared it to the three relevant newspapers, and there are more press speakers than actual newspapers. So, and that is not a good situation, because these used to be good journalists. But I'm a little bit worried when it comes to the situation that we as journalists do only the jobs for the money because they make twice as much as they would as journalists. And I think this is also part of the responsibility of the media corporations because they made for the lack of qualification because they turned jobs into really unattractive opportunities. Maybe you can explain the concept of Republik. We are financed by our readers. There's no advertising, so we don't have to do reporting that's accepted by anyone. So we belong to the readers alone. In Austria, the Federal Chancellery has 70 media staff, 70 that are paid from the taxes, of course. The Interior Ministry has 50. Profil, as a weekly magazine, it's like the Austrian Spiegel, if you will, has half the permanent staff, 25. That is an incredible misbalance. And if we keep this up, we're just going to report the things that the government actually wants because we lack the people to do the actual research. And of course, some journalists have grown close to certain politicians and maybe also have their eyes on the price of a future career. Let me talk about the 1st of May. Here in Vienna, the Federal Chancellery, it's the Ministry Council is always on a Wednesday, so on the day of labor, on Labor Day, the government had to work. And it was about the tax reform. The Chancellor was asked about the independent press and freedom of the press, and he made oaths and swore that he loves public broadcasting and how important the freedom of the press was to him. And then in the evening, there was a comment on the tax reform by the new editor-in-chief of the second channel of the public broadcasting company, and he talked about the not very social tax reform that threatens certain people with poverty, and he just applauded this tax reform. And I just thought to myself, oh, there's a big career in the making. I just wanted to add another question, because that leads me to two more issues. First of all, the business model. How can you have great reporters in a digitalized world, which is a topic that has been intensely debated in the last years? And the second thing is public broadcasting. And I'd like to start with my second question, just to clarify for the people from abroad, our guests from abroad. I work for a private broadcaster, but I'm not in favor of doing away with public broadcasting and public fees. I do believe that they could spend their money more wisely than just on Hollywood movies, but I'm still convinced that it's very important that we have it. But public broadcasting is under immense pressure. I'd like to start with the situation in Slovakia. In Slovakia, we have heard about a lot of pressure from politics on the public broadcasters. Yes, you can see that journalists are under pressure because there's a group of about 10 people who left their staff rooms because they didn't want to keep up work under these conditions. And there's just one last investigative channel contribution, and sometimes these broadcastings are then stopped by the government, and the public broadcasting company has improved in the last years, but still the pressure is building up. In radio, it's a bit different. It's also of a good quality, but it's becoming more and more difficult for the journalists working there. It's not as bad as in Hungary. I believe that in Hungary there's no public broadcasting anymore. It's state propaganda. That's clear. There's no independent local newspaper anymore. The problem of the East is the oligarchization of the society. We know this from the Czech Republic, where we have this super rich person who bought a media imperium and bought up all the important daily newspapers just to then kickstart a political career and then turn Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, but there is almost no critical reporting about him. In the east of Europe, you can react in a critical way. There is a really great example from Slovakia. N for Novine, which means daily newspaper in Slovak. It came into existence 3 years ago, and it's a real success story because everybody told us it wouldn't be possible to do that in a small country. A print newspaper, which has also a very strong online presence. And by now it has turned economically profitable. There's a subsidiary in the Czech Republic, has been around since January because they wanted to react to this development, and the journalists there make really little money. I also write for them on a regular basis. Sometimes we refused to get paid because we saw how important it was for the development of the democracy. And unfortunately, the economics are not in favor of print media, but there are certain models that make it work, and we need initiatives like that because we can see, especially in Hungary, in Slovakia, and Poland, we need more free press to stay democratic countries. Mr. Krüger, public broadcasting, is it a concept that dates back to the invention of radio and television, and the idea is that we have this monopoly and we don't want to have it fall into the hands of a single person or of a government, but it should always work in the favor of the public. So all of this has changed. Television doesn't have a monopoly, but there are digital monopolies such as Facebook, Google, and so on. How can public broadcasting develop in such a world, and what kind of jobs should they fulfill? First of all, you have to say that, especially in Germany, public broadcasting is not acting in a vacuum. You know that the advisory boards are staffed with politicians, and anytime it's about the political order for in media law, the politics does take an influence on it. So public broadcasting is not an innocent player in all of this, and I think it would be good for us to identify the cornerstones of public broadcasting and criticize them in a constructive way. We talked about sports rights. Why does the entertainment area in public broadcasting have to be in competition with the private ones, even though when it comes to the essential questions of informing the public, they have a mandate, a political and educational mandate, and this basic provision is something that is sometimes not fulfilled in the necessary extent. I think we have to self-criticize here a little bit. Of course, we also need digital strategies for our development, especially the American monopolies are cannibalizing the business through advertising. And in my opinion, we have to react to this through European law, but also national media law, where we can use to restrict the monopolies from abroad, and also take punitive measures. It seems that it's the punishments are not high enough to really make a difference. But if we want diversity of opinions and political and freedom of the press, we have to challenge these monopolies and also learn from the past and make sure that we have the regulatory framework that allows public broadcasters to stay competitive and also use their digital channels. Public broadcasting in Germany is on the right path, I think. But as far as regulatory frameworks are concerned, we have to ask ourselves in what relation public broadcasters have with private ones, because it's sometimes hard to compete. There are certain asymmetries at play that we have to reflect on. But our consequence should not be to weaken each other, but to strengthen all our players against the U.S. monopolies that collect data and gather data that they then pass on to the Secret Service. I told the story before that our Federal Agency for Civic Education was approached by Facebook because they wanted to cooperate with us, and it did make us suspicious. And so in the end, we have to always reflect on our own behavior, be critical of it, and make sure that we keep defending the cornerstones of a democratic society. I think this debate can go on and on and on, and I am originally from public broadcasting, and the argument was always the same. We have to keep playing Gone with the Wind 100 times because that's what people want to say. We can't only talk about political education, and I don't know what to do about them. That I just know that my children, who are about 30 years old, don't watch television anymore. They never turn on the television just to watch the news at the time that it's distributed. Not in public broadcasting, not in private. We have this new information culture that gets everything online, and I think we have to react to this development. And that is why the internet should be our main priority, and we have to make sure that there are reasonable offers online to make sure that people don't just get lies and stupid things on the internet. In Austria, we have two very well endowed free newspapers that are basically paid by the government and turn people into stupid robots, basically. People are tired in the morning, they just get one of these print newspapers, and that is what shapes their political views. It's horrible. Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the audience so far? You can also ask your questions in English. I'm Mr. Reitans. I'm a journalist. Solidarity with all colleagues, especially on a regional and local level, is really important to me. I also like to say that it's not true that there are just two independent newspapers in Austria. I think there's more than a dozen independent newspapers in Austria. Does Europe make enough for media? Just a short definition of media. Does that include Facebook? Is a blogger a medium nowadays? And who is Europe? What is Europe? Is it the European Union, the Commission, and what is Europe's responsibility when it comes to destroying monopolies and competition law and so on? A second question? Could you please get up, then stand up so you'll get the microphone.
One of, probably not from European area, a media person, about this case in Czech Republic where a guy bought everything and then became a PM, as I understand. And this similar case is happening in Eastern Europe. I'm from Mongolia. And people with money coming, buying all media, and later on becoming one of the, for example, our president has own TV channel, and many other politicians have own channels, sites, everything. How to get that injustice behavior limited by any movement of civic media, or if there is anything relevant that limits this kind of approach to media?
Thank you very much. Which country are you from?
I'm from Mongolia, yes.
Okay. Ich übersetze noch kurz mal, falls es auf der Seite nicht so verständlich war. Der Kollege ist aus Mongolia.
So this is a colleague from Mongolia. He says that the president has his own TV station, TV channel, and he asks how civil society can counter this development. Are there any other questions? Please wait for the microphone. Konstantin Plas from the Express in Cologne. I have a question to Ms. Möhring. You criticized the fact that a colleague from public broadcasting shed a positive light on the tax reform. I did a Google search, and also the correspondence for German newspapers such as the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung said that it's a model tax reform. Would you criticize media like the FAZ for being superficial, or how do you explain this, that such topics are transported in a similar way? Thank you very much for this question. Are there other questions from the audience? I would like to pass this on directly to Ms. Möhring. That was also my question, because this tax reform was something that it could be considered viewed positively. I didn't want to discredit the colleague that wrote about this. It just caught my attention because it was unusual compared to the usual practice of the ORF, which is the Austrian broadcaster. You should always show both sides, and maybe I was a little bit too strict. But in newspapers, you usually know where they lean politically, and that's not a bad thing. And as far as the FAZ is concerned, you know they're not communists, they're not socialists, they're rather conservative. And they have turned more conservative. Of course, you can find things that are positive about the tax reform, but it seemed to me very one-sided to just show the good things about it and not write about the bad impacts, because the public has the right to be extensively informed and not just about one aspect. The question from our colleague from Mongolia, I'd like to pass to you, because you've created a medium. I'm going to repeat the question. The question was that there's a country that has a lot of concentration when it comes to media, and the people who hold political power are the ones who are active in media, and how can you create a counterweight to this political concentration of power in the media? I wish I had a recipe, and I don't know anything about Mongolia, unfortunately. I imagine it's really beautiful, but I've never been there. And so I can't really answer your question, but in our country, the biggest party is the right-leaning, the SVP, and their founder has not only his own media channel, TV channel, but also a very large network of local newspapers that are for free. And he just bought them up, and nobody is interested in that. It's not turned a big scandal. These are all newspapers that are passed out for free, and they all belong to the one man in power. And we are observing this, but basically by the press of a button, he can just start up this huge propaganda machine. And maybe there are parallels to Mongolia, but also to the Czech Republic. And I think it has turned into an opportunity for really rich people that they buy up family-owned publishing companies and acquire power this way. If you're interested, maybe come and visit us, and we can give you some ideas of how to counter this.
I have an addition to make. I'm not familiar with the situation in Mongolia, but I know countries in transformation, and it's always the case. When you come from a totalitarian system and when you change over to a free democratic state, then the media have a special role to fulfill. And to build up this role, well, it takes some time. And very often there is also a lack of democratic education. Sometimes you have to start with elderly people, and then younger people come into play. They rise to power. You need new owners very often. Media play a very important role. If authoritarian tendencies are on the horizon, which is something that Slovakia dramatically experienced in the 1990s, then those who have risen to power try to manipulate the media, be it state media or private media. And so it is all the more important to not only look at the problem in the former communist countries, but also in the Western democracies. So ever more rich people and oligarchs understand that the media have a special role to play. And I think anybody can do it today, even if Facebook mainly acts as an advertising agency. You can still disseminate positive content. Just one example. After Jan Kuciak was murdered, young people, 18 to 20-year-olds, started a protest movement. Some of them had just left school. And during the first event, we expected to have 500 people. There was just one event and 20,000 people came. And the problem of the social media is that they are good and evil all rolled into one, but we are responsible for the contents that are being disseminated. And of course, these organizers would be attacked exactly via these social media, but you can still have a very positive impact even as an influencer, as a photographer, as a blogger. You can become a media, and set up a new civil society. This brings us back to the question of Mr. Reitan. First of all, Facebook and YouTube media. I took a close look at this question for my book Change the Game, which I wrote together with Markus Breitenegger, and we arrived at the conclusion that they constitute media, especially in terms of the dissemination of information. The question is, how should Europe react to the fact that these new media are around, exerting pressure on the media? Maybe you can summarize what you think about the European perspective. What can the European Commission do? What can European governments do? Well, first of all, you have to make a distinction between the classical media and the new types of media platforms that we have. Terminologically speaking, we should make a difference between the two. One thing is clear, the classic media and classic institutions have lost their gatekeeper function. Michael cited an example, and it showed very clearly that you create a counter-public via these platforms, but this has to do with your own civic commitment. And this is the new thing that has developed, that you create and disseminate information in a complementary fashion, creating and defending more pluralistic public opinions. Well, having the good and the evil all rolled into one. So we have to try to curb the evil by state measures, so that regarding monopolistic structures you have to be very, very careful, and you have to ensure that classic media are not cannibalized, which will leave us with monopolies. I don't think it's a bad thing if journalists voice an opinion, praise a tax reform. I think the seminal point here is that voicing an opinion has always been part of classic journalism. But if you think about news feeds or reportages, there is a journalistic ethic, and we need many perspectives because it is always about forming one's own opinion and not to use media as an indoctrination machinery. Journalists are not neutral entities, and thus I appreciate it very much. Well, I'm not a conservative, but even if conservative media or conservative positions are being voiced, I think, well, I can take a lot out of it, because this also enables contradiction. What we need for contradiction is a global media order voicing these contradictions so that the heterogeneity of a society is also reflected in the media that we have in our society. So, Mr. Reiter, we took a close look at what Europe, the European Union, could do, and we worked out 3 levels. Number 1, we wanted to create a level playing field, which means that these groups also pay their taxes, but also shoulder responsibility as editors. And secondly, so we should stop the battle of the dwarfs, and we should bank more on cooperation between private and public media in order to create a European alternative. And thirdly, we should develop a new definition of the public broadcasting mandate, transferring tasks to the digital media, and maybe we will come up with a European platform. One example, we have an association of researchers that we set up together with public broadcasting media. This constitutes a true innovation. So, the results that have sprung from this association have greatly enriched the quality of journalism. Robina Möhring, as representative of Reporters Without Borders, I would like to go back to our initial question. The freedom of the press in Europe has come under increasing pressure from governments, but also when it comes to question of the business model and the battle between economic and journalistic goals. In order to tie in with the question once again, what can and should European institutions do in order to ensure freedom of the press? So is it just about financial means, or does it go deeper? I think it goes deeper. It's about a self-image in democratic and political terms. If this is not pronounced enough, then the EU could help us to let it grow even further. I think we should have certain regulations applicable for everyone. I discussed it a lot with Vivian Redding, who said that it is very complicated to enforce all this at member state level. So there are many drafts and papers in the drawers which are constantly being put on the back burner by member states. So we have to stay committed in this regard. We have to rework them and we have to adapt them to the fashion of the time. I also think that a cooperation between private and public media is necessary. And the role of investigative journalism has to be fostered even more in the future. This is extremely important because there are still states that adhere to the dogma of confidentiality in public offices. And if we can do this, then also journalists will gain in importance and acceptance because they show they know how to do research and they know what to do. Our role is to provide information, not only to defend our trade union rights. Trade union rights do not have anything to do with freedom of the press. And if the self-image, if journalists' self-image can be burnished in the future, and they have already started doing that in the civil society of journalism, then also the media will stand a chance to gain in acceptance and also to foster democracy. Thank you very much. Thank you most cordially. I would like to make a few recommendations by the book Troll. It's about troll factories. Become a member of Republik and take a close look at how such a media works. And what is also very important, become a member of Reporters Without Borders. It would be of extreme benefit to the organization and to the freedom of the press. Thank you very much.